Think for a second about how much heavy lifting a single word can do. Like how changing just one word in a well-known, established phrase can instantly signal the end of an entire geopolitical era.
Yeah, it really is a fascinating dynamic to observe.
Yeah.
Because, well, we usually expect history to announce itself with these sweeping, dramatic events, right? But if you look closely at media and linguistics, sometimes the most profound structural shifts in the world are cemented by just the tiniest of rhetorical tweaks.
Right, and today we are doing a deep dive into a stack of media analyses that show how Japanese media is quietly announcing exactly that kind of shift. We're going to look at how a simple four-character idiom is being used to tell the business world that the golden age of trade with China is officially over.
Which is huge.
It is huge. We're going to explore this historical shift from what was once a booming economic partnership to, well, a dual freeze. And we'll decode the linguistic architecture that makes this new political rhetoric so powerful.
It's just a perfect case study, really, in how language doesn't merely describe a situation after the fact. In the hands of major media outlets, language actively shapes the boundaries of how the public and the private sector even conceptualize their reality.
Exactly. I mean, the best way I can frame what we are about to discuss for you listening is to think about changing a single word in your relationship status online. Like going from in a relationship to it's complicated.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Right. It is just one word, but it completely alters the reality of how the entire world views your situation. And honestly, how you start to view it yourself.
That analogy holds up incredibly well when applied to the current relationship between two of the world's largest economies.
Yeah.
The status has fundamentally changed and, the media has formalized it.
So let's start with the baseline, because to really appreciate the weight of this new term dominating Japanese headlines, we have to understand the era it replaced. So walk me through the historical status quo. What was the old relationship status?
Well, for that, we really need to look back to the early 2000s. If we focus on the era of Prime Minister Junichiro Koizumi, we see the crystallization of a very specific dynamic. So for roughly 2 decades, the standard phrase used by Japanese society, the media, and the political class to describe Sino-Japanese relations was Seirei Kenetsu.
Seirei Kenetsu. Okay, what is the literal translation of that?
It translates directly to cold politics, hot economics.
Cold politics, hot economics. Wow, okay. That implies a rather extreme separation of church and state, so to speak.
It was a massive paradox.
Yeah.
But it was the accepted, lived reality. On one hand, you had this significant and highly visible friction over politics, right? Like territorial disputes in the East China Sea, historical grievances, diplomatic standoffs.
The cold politics part.
Exactly, the cold politics. But simultaneously, the private sector was operating on an entirely different wavelength. Trade volumes were just exploding, and Japanese foreign direct investment into China was growing at a blistering pace. And that was the hot economics.
But hold on, if you're listening to this and thinking, well, politicians argue all the time, why should businesses care? We still have to ask how that is practically possible over a sustained period. I mean, businesses care about predictability, right, and profit.
Right, absolutely.
If the governments are constantly clashing and there's genuine geopolitical tension, wouldn't a Japanese CEO be terrified of sudden tariffs or sanctions? Like, what actually allowed them to just ignore the political temperature?
That is a really vital question because, that separation seems totally counterintuitive today. But at the time, both sides essentially agreed to compartmentalize.
Like an unspoken agreement.
Pretty much. The assumption driving this era was that mutual economic benefit was so overwhelmingly vital to both nations that it would just, remain insulated.
Okay.
Organizations like the Kaidenrun, which is the highly influential Japan Business Federation, they basically operated under the belief that the promise of the massive Chinese market and the deep integration of manufacturing supply chains provided a permanent firewall.
So the logic was essentially, yes, the diplomats are arguing on Monday, but the economic fundamentals are too lucrative for either side to actually disrupt the CEOs signing billion-dollar deals on Tuesday.
Yeah, that was the prevailing logic. The business community felt incredibly secure in their hot economics bubble. However, the sources we're looking at which analyze recent rhetoric coming from those exact same business circles like the Kaidanren and mainstream media powerhouses like the Nikkei and the Asahi Shimbun, they point out that this era of separation has entirely collapsed.
Wow, so the firewall is just gone.
It is gone. The mainstream consensus now recognizes that relations have entered a totally frozen phase across the board, and because the structural reality shifted, Well, the language had to shift to reflect it. So the new phrase that has basically taken over the media ecosystem is Seirei Keirei, which means cold politics, cold economics.
Cold politics, cold economics. So both dimensions are deteriorating simultaneously, and they are now, I guess, intrinsically linked.
Yes. The new term covers the linked deterioration perfectly. But what the linguistic analyses in our sources focus on is how the media chose to communicate this.
Which brings us to the actual mechanics of the language itself, because reporters could have just written headlines saying, trade is down due to diplomatic tension.
Right, they could have.
But they didn't do that. They coalesced around this specific term, Seirei Keirei. So why did this specific phrase catch on so rapidly?
To understand that, we have to look at the unique linguistic architecture of Japanese. The language relies heavily on four-character idioms, which are known as Yojikugo.
Yojikugo.
Yeah, and these are traditionally used to express massive macro-level concepts, whether they're political, economic, or philosophical.
Just so we're all on the same page, these four-character idioms aren't just like arbitrary words thrown together, right? There's a specific tradition behind them.
That is correct. They are an inheritance from the broader Sinosphere. The cultural and linguistic region heavily influenced by traditional Chinese characters. In Japanese political discourse, a well-crafted Yojikugo carries a lot of intellectual weight and a distinct formal gravity. They possess this concise, symmetrical beauty that basically signals to the reader that a major overarching concept is being presented.
It essentially packs a whole textbook's worth of geopolitical theory into just four characters.
Exactly.
Let's look at the phonetics for a second, because even to a non-speaker, the rhythm is really striking. If you break it down, it's Seirei Keirei.
The phonetic structure is brilliant. As the linguistic reports highlight, these syllables utilize what are called onyomi readings.
Meaning these are the traditional Chinese-derived pronunciations of those characters, rather than the native Japanese pronunciations, which is what gives it that formal, almost academic rhythm, right?
Spot on. The onyomi readings create a very rhythmic, rhyming cadence. Seirei Keirei is incredibly catchy.
Right.
It is highly spreadable. But the true genius here is what linguists call substitution word formation.
Oh, interesting. How does that work in this context?
Well, the media did not invent a completely new political term from scratch. Introducing a novel concept requires the public to expend mental energy to learn and internalize it.
True. People don't like learning new jargon.
Exactly. Instead, they took the traditional, universally understood phrase Seirei Kenetsu and simply substituted the very last character.
So they took netsu, the character for hot,
and swapped it for rei, the character for cold.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, by retaining 3/4 of the established phrase, the media managed to summarize a massive shift in a geopolitical era with an incredibly low cognitive cost to the public.
It's like taking a beloved classic romantic movie title and swapping the final word to instantly turn it into a horror movie.
Yes, that's a great way to think about it.
Your brain immediately recognizes the old structure. It feels deeply familiar, but then you hit that substituted word and you instantly grasp the terrifying new context.
That visual captures the psychological effect perfectly. You are drawn in by the comfort of the familiar linguistic structure, only to be delivered a very uncomfortable new reality.
So we have this linguistic laboratory creating a highly efficient, memorable term. But, a term only has power if it's used. Let's transition to the actual media deployment. How do these major outlets take Seirei Keirei and use it to alter public and corporate perception?
The media analysis shows that outlets like the Nikkei, NHK, and Sankei, which, by the way, often have varying editorial slants, are universally using Seirei Keirei as a qualitative tool.
Meaning it's not just a passing observation.
Right. It isn't just a descriptive phrase buried in a paragraph somewhere.
Yeah.
It is deployed prominently in analytical columns and bold headlines as a stark warning to the Japanese business world.
A warning that the firewall they relied on for 20 years is an illusion.
Yes. The underlying message of these articles is that businesses can no longer afford to operate under the assumption that political friction won't devastate their bottom line. The media is essentially using the rhythmic gravity of this four-character idiom to force the private sector to wake up to the structural reality.
Okay, so Seirei Keirei is the headline. It's the warning siren. But a warning is just the beginning of the conversation. If I am a Japanese executive reading the Nikkei and the headline tells me the era of hot economics is over, what are the actual practical defensive steps the article is telling me to take? Like, what is the vocabulary of the strategy that follows that warning?
That leads us to what the sources call the satellite buzzwords. Seirei Keirei rarely appears alone. It operates as like the center of gravity for a specific vocabulary chain that media outlets pair with it to spell out the new corporate playbook.
Okay, so what are the words in that orbit?
The first major term in this cluster is Keizai Anzen Hosho,
Which translates to...
economic security.
Oh, wow. So economics is no longer just about maximizing shareholder value or finding the cheapest labor. It is now fundamentally framed as a matter of national defense.
Precisely.
How does that actually manifest for a business?
Well, it manifests through government intervention and corporate compliance. It means protecting supply chains, treating critical infrastructure as vulnerable, and viewing the export of advanced technologies like semiconductors, for instance, through a military and strategic lens rather than purely a commercial one.
That definitely kills the hot economics vibe. If you have the government auditing your supply chain for national security risks, I mean, the era of frictionless trade is just over. What are the other satellite terms?
You also frequently see the term Derisuku, which is the Japanese phonetic adaptation of the English concept de-risking. And closely tied to that is Datsuchugoku, which translates to desynthesization.
Desynthesization. That sounds severe. Does that mean the media is telling businesses to completely pull out of China?
Not necessarily a total withdrawal, no. But it refers to the active strategy of breaking away from or severely reducing an over-reliance on the Chinese market.
Like spreading your bets.
Exactly. In practical terms, this looks like the China Plus One strategy, where a Japanese company might keep an existing factory in China to serve the local market, but they will build their next factory in Vietnam or India to ensure their global supply chain isn't entirely dependent on a single politically volatile node.
So it's a strategic diversification driven by fear rather than opportunity.
Yes. And all of these terms, economic security, de-risking, desynthesization, they fall under the broader umbrella of another heavily used term in these reports, which is China risk.
China risk.
Right. So when you see Seirei Keirei in a headline, you are seeing it establish the macro environment, while these satellite terms cluster around it to provide the tactical vocabulary of a deep freeze. They form an entire lexicon of cooling, essentially.
Let's dig into the actual mechanics of this deep freeze, because these media warnings reflect a very harsh reality on the ground. Walk me through how political cold and economic cold actually trigger one another. What is the chain reaction here?
The mechanics of this transmission are tangible and structural. When you have geopolitical rivalry and security concerns the political cold, it directly forces governments to mandate defensive economic postures.
Right, because if the political leadership doesn't trust the government across the water, they are going to pass legislation that restricts what their own companies can do.
Exactly. And that legislation is the economic cold. The lack of political trust results in new trade barriers, intense investment screening, and tech blockades. We see this acutely with export controls on semiconductor manufacturing equipment. The political distrust literally legislates the economic freeze.
Oh, wait, let me push back on that for a second. Businesses lobby their governments all the time, right?
Sure, constantly.
So if there is still money to be made, why wouldn't the Kaidanren or major Japanese conglomerates just exert massive pressure on Tokyo to ease up on the politics so they can keep trading? What actually forces their hand to accept this economic cold?
That brings us to perhaps the most crucial and honestly dangerous insight from the analysis. The sources discuss the loss of the ballast stone effect.
The ballast stone, like the heavy weights placed in the hull of a ship?
Exactly. In maritime terms, ballast lowers a ship's center of gravity, providing stability in rough waters and preventing it from capsizing.
Right.
Well, historically, during the cold politics, hot economics era, those robust, deeply intertwined economic ties acted as the geopolitical ballast stone.
Oh, I see. So even when the diplomatic winds were blowing a gale, the sheer weight of mutual profits kept the relationship from flipping over.
Yes, that's exactly it. In the past, when a political crisis flared up, say, over a territorial dispute, there was immense pressure from the private sector on both sides to quietly de-escalate.
Because there was too much money on the line.
Precisely. Politicians knew they couldn't push their hardline rhetoric past a certain point because the economic floor was too valuable. The business community acted as a constraint on political extremism.
I see. So if the economic ties were the ballast, what happens now that hot economics has become cold economics.
The ballast stone has essentially been thrown overboard.
Wow.
Because business investment desire has evaporated due to the China risk we discussed, the relationship has lost its built-in buffer zone.
This sounds like a devastating feedback loop. Because the businesses are de-risking and pulling their money out, they no longer have a financial incentive to lobby for peace.
Right.
And without the business community acting as a constraint and keeping things grounded, there is absolutely nothing holding back the politicians from engaging in harder, more aggressive posturing.
That is the structural reality we are facing. The economic cold removes the safety net. Without the ballast, the ship is highly vulnerable to the political cold, which accelerates aggressive policies, which in turn creates more legislation that deepens the economic cold.
It just feeds on itself.
They feed on each other in a continuous downward spiral. The economic floor has dropped out, leaving nothing to arrest the political freefall.
That is a staggering shift in the regional dynamic. It makes total sense why the media isn't just treating this as a temporary dip in quarterly earnings.
And this is why, as our sources conclude, Seirei Keirei is far more than just a descriptive buzzword. It is the ultimate summary of a structural paradigm shift.
Yeah.
It is a single rhythmic word that perfectly captures the reality of intertwined, mutually reinforcing political and economic friction. It is basically the new operating system for Sino-Japanese relations.
Let's take a moment to look back at the ground we've covered today. We started in this era of bustling, paradoxical trade, the cold politics, hot economics of the early 2000s, where businesses believed they could just out-earn political friction.
Yeah, that firewall they relied on.
Right. And we traced how that shifted into the frozen feedback loop reality of cold politics, cold economics.
And we saw how the Japanese media utilize the incredibly concise symmetrical power of a four-character idiom to drill this new paradigm into the public consciousness, moving from the headline warning to the practical vocabulary of de-risking.
Using that rhyming, catchy Seirei Keirei to instantly communicate a massive geopolitical shift with almost zero cognitive effort for the reader. It is a masterclass in linguistic engineering, even if the reality it describes is deeply sobering.
It really is. Ultimately, language is the framework through which we understand our reality. When the media shifts that framework, the boundaries of what is considered possible or expected shift along with it.
Which brings us right back to the idea of a single word changing everything. I want to leave you listening with something to think about, building on this idea of linguistic architecture. We've seen how effectively a term like Seirei Keirei can solidify a new, colder reality in the minds of the public and the business sector. But if language is this powerful at shaping our understanding, what happens when politicians and the media exclusively rely on terms that reinforce a cold paradigm?
That's a great question.
Does the constant rhythmic repetition of phrases like Seirei Keirei actually trap us in that frozen reality? If we no longer have the vocabulary for a new kind of warmth or cooperation, can we ever achieve it again?